Ever crack open a PhD dissertation and think, whoa, this is intense?
Right. Well, that's kind of what we're dealing with today.
Yeah.
We're diving into Does Yahweh Exist?
Okay.
It's by JW Gericke.
All right. It's a trip and a half, let me tell you.
It's not your typical dissertation, that's for sure.
No.
It's,
Gericke's really taking us on his own personal journey of questioning the existence of Yahweh as he's reading the Old Testament.
Exactly.
We've got excerpts from his autobiography of a died-again Christian.
Which adds a whole other layer to this.
Which is so fascinating.
Yeah.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting to me.
We're not here to tell you what to believe.
Right.
But to explore how one scholar grappled with
some really, really big questions about faith and reason.
And to be clear, when we talk about the existence of Yahweh, we're in a philosophical realm.
Okay.
That often uses the terms realism versus anti-realism.
Okay, because it's not as easy as just saying he exists or he doesn't exist.
Exactly.
So realism in this context means you think that Yahweh, as described in the Old Testament,
is a real being, independent of us believing in him.
Okay.
Anti-realism, on the other hand, suggests that maybe Yahweh is more of a product of human imagination or culture, or both.
So it's kind of like the difference between like believing in gravity,
which we know is real because stuff falls down,
right,
versus believing in like a lucky rabbit's foot.
It might make you feel lucky, but it's not actually controlling the universe.
Right. That's a great way to put it.
And Gericke is leaning heavily towards anti-realism.
He lays out 7 arguments against the existence of Yahweh.
And his doubts seem to really stem from inconsistencies he sees within the text itself.
Interesting. And his first argument dives right into that.
He calls it theological pluralism.
Okay.
Which is a mouthful, but essentially what he's saying is that
the Bible doesn't offer like one neat and tidy picture of Yahweh.
Have you ever noticed how, like, in some passages, Yahweh's described as unchanging?
Sure.
But then in others, he's, like, regretting his actions?
Right. That's one of the contradictions he brings up.
And it's not just about, you know, different writing styles over time.
Right.
He's pointing to, like, fundamental differences in how Yahweh is portrayed.
Yeah.
His nature, his actions, even his appearance.
It's almost as if different authors were projecting their own ideas
onto this one figure.
Right.
Creating multiple versions of Yahweh that don't quite fit together.
Right. It's like trying to put a puzzle together where the pieces keep changing shape.
If the source material can't even agree on who Yahweh is, how can we be sure he exists as this one single concrete entity?
Okay, so we've got this potential issue of an inconsistent Yahweh.
And this leads perfectly into his next argument,
which tackles one of the biggest theological dilemmas out there.
The problem of evil.
Yeah, the classic.
This one's plagued theologians for centuries.
If Yahweh is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why is there so much suffering in the Old Testament? Wars, famines, plagues.
Often depicted as either directly caused by Yahweh or allowed to happen by him.
It's hard to reconcile.
If you believe in a loving God, it's hard to wrap your head around that level of suffering.
Especially when it seems preventable.
Right.
I mean, have you ever struggled with that, even on a personal level?
When bad things happen, like where do we draw the line between
God's plan and just plain bad luck or, you know, human cruelty?
Yeah. It's a question that forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths
about the world and the nature of suffering.
Yeah.
And Gericke doesn't shy away from that discomfort.
Okay.
He dives right into it with his next argument,
which he calls the argument from deconstruction by orthodoxy reconstructed.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What is he getting at with this one?
All right, so imagine you're trying to force square blocks into a round hole.
Okay.
You can jam them in there.
But something's got to give right.
Right.
That's kind of what he's saying about this traditional view of Yahweh.
All-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. He argues that if we cling too tightly to that perfect image of God, we have to then ignore or reinterpret huge chunks of the Old Testament.
Just don't fit.
So it's like we're making the text say what we want it to say,
instead of grappling with what it's actually saying.
Exactly. And Gericke finds that problematic.
He'd rather confront the contradictions head on.
Okay.
Which leads him to his next point. The historically conditioned nature of belief.
All right, so what does that mean? Are we saying that our beliefs are just products of our time?
Well, he argues that all beliefs, including religious belief,
are shaped by their historical and cultural context.
So you're saying our understanding of Yahweh might be more about ancient Israelite culture
than some, like, timeless truth.
Wow.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And it leads to a really important question.
If our understanding of Yahweh is so tied to the time and place
Yeah.
in which those beliefs originated, what makes them unique.
Okay.
What makes them special.
Right.
Why should those beliefs hold more weight
Than the beliefs of other cultures or other historical periods.
Yeah, it's a question that can really make you pause and examine your own assumptions.
Yeah.
And that discomfort, that questioning, leads us to Gericke's next argument, which he calls the argument from polymorphic projection.
Okay, polymorphic projection. That sounds like something straight out of like a sci-fi movie.
What is that all about?
Okay, so think of it this way.
Okay.
Remember when you were a kid and you used to give your toys personality?
Oh, yeah.
You'd imagine they had feelings, thoughts, maybe even like whole backstories.
Totally. Yeah, my teddy bear was like writing his memoirs in my head.
Exactly.
Well, Gericke argues that we do something similar with our concept of God. We project our own needs and desires, even our limitations, onto this higher power.
So you're saying that Yahweh, as he's depicted in the Old Testament, might be a reflection
of ancient Israelite hopes and fears and social structures.
That's the gist of it.
He points out how Yahweh's needs, like demanding worship or getting jealous of other gods,
seem very human, very in line with the worldview of the people who wrote those stories.
So it's like those ink blot tests.
Right.
We see something in them, but what we see says more about us than the ink blot itself.
Precisely.
Right.
And this leads Gericke to an even more provocative argument. The argument from the demythologization of culture.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. Hit us with it.
All right, so think about how easily we dismiss the gods of other cultures as myths.
Zeus, Thor.
Right.
Those are great stories.
But we generally accept them as products of their time and place.
Right.
So Gericke asks, why should we treat Yahweh any differently?
Whoa, that's a big question. But I mean, he has a point.
If we're being honest with ourselves, Yahweh's origins, his stories.
They share a lot in common with those other gods we now consider mythical.
Exactly.
Gericke argues that if we apply a critical lens to other cultures' gods,
we should be willing to do the same with Yahweh.
Right.
And that can be a difficult pill to swallow.
For people who hold those beliefs close to their hearts.
Yeah, it's like he's asking us to hold two things in our minds at the same time.
To respect the power and influence these beliefs have, but also acknowledge
their potential roots in mythology. No wonder this dissertation caused such a stir.
It certainly did.
And Gericke saves his most striking argument for last. The argument from the collapse of Old Testament cosmology.
Okay, collapse of Old Testament cosmology. Now that sounds intense. What's he getting at with that one?
So Gericke reminds us that the Bible describes a universe
that we now know is inaccurate.
Right.
A flat earth, a sky ocean.
Things we've proven false through scientific discovery.
Yeah, we've come a long way from thinking the earth is the center of everything.
Right.
And here's the thing. Yahweh is described as existing within that outdated cosmology.
So Gericke argues that if the universe doesn't work the way the Bible describes it, then how can we be sure that Yahweh, as depicted in that framework, actually exists?
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand.
If the foundation crumbles, the whole thing goes...
That's a great analogy.
And it gets to the heart of Gericke's point.
Yeah.
He's not trying to be disrespectful, but he is pointing out that our understanding of the universe has evolved. And maybe, just maybe, our understanding of God needs to evolve with it.
Wow. Those are some heavy implications. It's one thing to debate, abstract theological concepts.
But to question the very foundation on which those concepts are built.
That's a whole other level.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that Gericke isn't just throwing out these arguments.
Into the void.
Right.
He's grappling with them personally, emotionally.
As we see in his autobiography of a died-again Christian.
Right, because this isn't just an intellectual exercise for him.
This is deeply personal.
It is.
Speaking of which, I'm really curious to dive into Gericke's personal story now.
Okay.
He grew up deeply devout.
A true believer, as he describes himself.
Right.
But then seminary happened.
Yeah.
And
he talks about being exposed to biblical criticism.
Right.
Different interpretations of scripture.
Yeah.
Even historical contradictions that he couldn't just ignore.
Yeah.
It's like his whole worldview was being challenged.
Absolutely.
And that's where the died again part of his story comes in.
Okay.
He went through this profound period of doubt, questioning everything he thought he knew.
Right.
It's actually a common experience, even if we don't always talk about it openly. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance.
Right.
When you're holding on to two conflicting beliefs at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like that feeling when you find out a hero of yours has done something awful. You want to hold on to the good, you know? But the bad news just keeps chipping away at that image.
Exactly.
And Gericke describes this period of his life as incredibly painful, even traumatic. It's like the rug was pulled out from under him.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. He doesn't shy away from that pain in his writing. He shares it openly, honestly.
Right.
And I think that's what makes his autobiography so powerful.
Absolutely.
It's one thing to hear these arguments in a detached academic way.
Right.
But to hear someone wrestling with them on a personal level, with such raw honesty, that makes you pay attention.
It does.
And it reminds us that questioning your beliefs, even the ones you hold most dear, doesn't make you a bad person or a weak believer.
Yeah.
It makes you human.
Right.
You know, as we've been talking about Gericke's journey, something he wrote keeps coming back to me.
Okay.
If a thesis falls in the library and there is nobody who reads it, does it make a sound?
Right.
It's like that old tree falling in the forest riddle.
Right.
And it gets at a question that I think runs through Gericke's entire dissertation.
Yeah.
Does unexamined faith hold the same weight as faith that has been challenged and wrestled with?
That's a good question.
It makes you wonder if blindly accepting something without questioning it, without really engaging with it, diminishes its value somehow.
It's a profound question.
And it's not just about faith. It applies to any belief we hold, any assumption we make about the world. Are we willing to examine those beliefs even if it's uncomfortable? And maybe that's the real takeaway from Gericke's work.
Right. Yep.
Not necessarily to convince us that Yahweh doesn't exist, but to encourage us to engage in that process of questioning, of seeking, even if the answers are elusive. He's not saying he has all the answers.
Right.
But he's inviting us to grapple with the big questions alongside him. And that's a journey worth taking, even if it's challenging.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So for anyone listening who's been on a similar journey, who's grappled with doubt or wrestled with their own faith, Gericke's story is a powerful reminder that you're not alone.
Right.
And that questioning, that searching can ultimately lead to a deeper, more meaningful understanding of yourself and what you believe.
Right.
Well said. If you're interested in exploring Gericke's work further, and trust me, it's a fascinating read, though maybe not for the faint of heart, we'll have a link to his dissertation on our website.
Right.
It's a challenging but ultimately rewarding deep dive.
It really is.
It really is. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
Be sure to join us next time when we'll be diving into it.
Yeah.
But you'll just have to wait and see.